This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
In 1631, the Lord Mayor of the City of London sent a precept to the Great 12 of some of the lesser livery companies, ordering them to deliver wheatmeal directly to the aldermen of the city wards, rather than to the markets, as had been the custom for the previous 30 or so years. The reason for this decision, and the only year in which this arrangement took place, was the concern that at a time of rising grain prices, the poor were not getting access to the subsidised meal delivered to the markets. Another precept, issued shortly before and sent to the aldermen of the wards, instructed them to conduct an audit at parish level of the number of poor and to collect their names, and also whether the price of meal sent by the companies to the markets in quantities of 1/2 peck was accessible to the poor. The concern being that the meal was not reaching, quote, the truly poor, unquote. If such people could be identified, badging was not mentioned but was one way used to identify pensioners, then the ward and parish officials could target those most in need. It was also clear to the authorities, as reported to Common Council, that the subsidised meal was being taken up by contrary people and not reaching, quote, the poor and feebler sort, unquote. A fuller explanation has been found in the records of the Mercer's Company in the slide shown here. The meal sold in quantities of not more than 1/2 or 1 peck was priced at 6 shillings a bushel, equivalent to a wholesale price for grain of just over 38 shillings a quarter, when the market price of wheat was around 50 shillings per quarter. This episode provides an example of the interactions which took place between the city authorities on the one hand and the livery companies, wards and parishes on the other, so that together they were able to provide food to the poor. The delivery of cheaper meal to the poor in markets was an essential component of the city's strategy. It was highlighted by Archer at times of real shortage in the 1590s. Quote, London led the way, financing 10,000 quarters of grain each year and selling it at 4 pence per bushel under the market prices, unquote. This provision is referred to obliquely but without real clarity as to its purpose and extent by Grass, McGrath, Herbert and others for the period after 1600. The central question of my thesis is to what extent the city authorities were involved in the provision and delivery of some of the essentials which the inhabitants would have required, focusing on bread, grain and coal in the first part of the 17th century. The secondary question is how the various institutions, central and city government, livery companies, traders, wards and parishes, interacted to achieve this. Thirdly, whether the various points of crisis, higher prices and shortages and plague, affected the way the institutions responded. My plan in a way is to extend and expand the ideas from the work of Archer and others on the problems of the 1590s. After a brief introduction, I shall be discussing 3 aspects of the work, followed by a summary and conclusions. I provided some background for those of you who have trouble differentiating your pecks from your bushels. I shall not be discussing the evidence for the effectiveness of intervention in this talk, but measures of success or failure could include annual mortality rates, the absence of food riots used as a measure of food supply stability by Burstead, Lawson and Hindle, and an econometric approach assessing changes in grain prices by Nielsen. I shall not be able to cover the role of wards and parishes this evening. There are some important general points. I've limited my study to the years 1600 to 1640. This was the period after the introduction of the Elizabethan Poor Laws in their final form. It includes several years of poor harvests and price rises, 2 severe episodes of plague and 2 lesser ones. The years of personal rule by Charles I, and the reintroduction or reinforcement of the measures to control vagrants, vagabonds, etc., when the Book of Orders was reissued in the early 1630s. Furthermore, at the start of the century, the system of poor relief within the City of London changed from one in which Christ's Hospital played a pivotal role in receiving and distributing money to parishes to one in which the city authorities took greater control after the poor assessment exercise in 1598. I've ended in 1640 partly to limit the amount of work involved, but also because it became apparent that the city records on bread and grain were less numerous after that date. There are two more important points relevant to my presentation. Firstly, I've used population estimates in some of my calculations on grain and fuel supplies, and I've used the work of Professor Harding from her London Journal publication, and also the population figure provided by Lord Mayor Dury in the 1630 to 1631 census. There will always be concerns that these estimates relied on ward and parish submissions and would therefore have excluded those outside the system, inevitably a group which may have included the more destitute. Estimates of the number of poor and as a proportion of total population are problematic. My conclusion is that the primary sources generally only included those in receipt of regular alms or pensions, or those known to parish officials. The second is the identification of years when there was likely to be added pressure through poor harvests. Here I refer to the work of Hoskins based on a wider base price series. This shows the years of poor harvests which he identified. Time does not permit further discussion of his methodology, which has been criticised by Harrison and others, but provides a useful reference point for my study. Therefore, the years of higher prices in London may have been in or after 1608, 1622, and 1630, and which, taken together with the years of plague in 1603, 1625, and to a lesser extent 1630 and 1636, can be described as potential, quote, crisis, unquote, years. First, the assize of bread. The assize of bread was the means by which the weight of bread was regulated on a countrywide basis by magistrates, the Court of Aldermen in the case of London. The assize of bread was predicated on the principle that a certain quantity of bread could be baked from a quarter of wheat, and the weight of the various types of loaf was calculated from the price paid in the market in the locality of the bakery. There has been an assumption that not only was this system designed to ensure consistency in baking and weight of bread, but it was also supposed to protect the consumer by regulating prices fairly. Bolton made reference to the assize of bread in his paper on food prices and the standard of living in London in the century of revolution, which includes my period of study. In this graph, which I've adapted from his paper, he plotted the annual changes in bread prices against the price of flour, using a price index for the decade 1601 to 1610 as the baseline against which percentage changes have been plotted. Bolton considered this graph to be crucial in his discussion on the pricing of bread, as it demonstrated a marked divergence between the price of bread and the price of flour. From the early to mid-1620s onwards. Wheat prices are absent, as there is no extant series for that period in London. Bolton used the price of a £4 loaf, which was the basis for the bread prices later on in the series, reported originally by Beveridge and later Mitchell and Dean. Bolton had calculated the price of this loaf using the assize data from the early 17th century. The lack of distinction between wheaten and household is incorrect. Bolton concluded from this graph that there were several possible explanations for this divergence: that the assize was ignored or not enforced, that London loaves were lighter, or that bakers' profits were squeezed. I shall demonstrate that the first two assertions are incorrect, and that the third, on bakers' profits, merits further consideration. I've used data from the early 17th century publications under the authorship of John Powell, gentleman and clerk of the markets, and John Penkethman, gentleman and accountant. For these purposes, we need to focus on the left, on the way that the assize or the weight of the 1 penny wheaten loaf was calculated from a price of a quarter of wheat. As you can see, if we can identify the price of a quarter of wheat, we can then read off the weights of the various types of loaf. For simplicity, I've used the data from John Penkethman's publication from 1638 on the assize, in which he also presented tables on the difference between avoirdupois and troy pounds and ounces. The principles are the same, and I'm using the troy column. The text of both publications makes clear that the assize was calculated from the price of wheat after the 6-shilling baker's allowance had been added to the market price of second wheat. I have taken this data to plot the relationship between the price of wheat and the weight of the 1 penny wheaten loaf, the basis of the assize. This shows the weight of the penny wheaten loaf falls in a non-linear fashion as the price of wheat rises. The two lines show the difference in weights if the baker's allowance of 6 shillings per quarter had not been added before the assize was set. This means in effect that the weight of bread is lower than it would have been if the allowance had not been added. We can show this by highlighting a point on the lighter line, the lower line, at 40 shillings per quarter, where the weight of the loaf would be 11 ounces, whereas without the allowance on the right, the weight would have been 12.5 ounces. Would have been higher at 12.5 ounces. The other important point to note is that the consumer received less bread for his penny as prices went up. I do not want to spend time discussing the evolution of the assize of bread or some of the misconceptions present in the earlier work of Webb and Webb, Ross, Nicholas and Ashley. The best account is by Davis in his 2004 article in the Economic History Review on the medieval assize of bread. Suffice to say, prior to the end of the 16th century, bakers were expected to produce a fixed number of loaves from a quarter of wheat. But in the early 17th century, to avoid confusion on the calculations of the weights of the various different types of loaf, it was agreed that a fixed weight of bread was to be baked from a quarter of wheat, rather than the number of loaves, and that this should form the basis of what was expected of the baker. This amount had originally been determined by bakers under the watchful eye of aldermen using the Guildhall ovens. The baker also received an allowance of 6 shillings per quarter of wheat baked to cover his costs to the miller, his journeyman, for fuel and yeast, and clothes and food for his family. As mentioned earlier, the allowance was added to the market price of wheat before the assize was set. In addition, the baker was able to keep any extra bread described as advantage bread or advantage loaves, which he had baked over and above the prescribed amount, plus any bran arising from the bolting process. Various descriptions place this amount of bread at 418 pounds, but not specifying whether this is avoirdupois or troy pounds. It must be the former, and would have approximated to 508 pounds troy. And there would have been 24 pounds 14 ounces advantage bread in avoirdupois. Interestingly, none of the publications by John Powell or John Penkethman made any mention of this amount or bread for advantage. I've collected data on the assize of bread primarily from the repertories, but also the documents of the Bakers' Company held at Guildhall. And this is a fairly typical paragraph from the repertory setting the assize, or the weight of the 1 penny wheaten loaf, in whole ounces, and it was always in whole ounces, before highlighting the ratio between the wheaten and white loaf, which of course was lighter. And the requirement was upon bakers who were represented in the court by the master and or wardens of the White Bakers' Company to keep the assize. This slide demonstrates that the assize was set throughout the period 1600 to 1640, with time in months as the data set is irregular. There are some years for which I've not been able to find records, and in others the assize was reset several times. For instance, in 1619, when the weight of the 1 penny wheaten loaf rose from 12 ounces in January to 16 ounces by the end of the year, showing that the assize was adjusted as wheat prices fell. I could have derived a wheat price series for London from this data, but this would only have confirmed the mathematical relationship between the weight of bread and the price of wheat. It would not have provided independent verification of whether the assize really did alter as the price of wheat rose or fell. Ideally, a separate price series is needed to show that the assize was working properly. Unfortunately, there is no extant series for the price of wheat in London for the period of study. Therefore, I decided to use the price paid for wheat at the Windsor market as payment in rent to Eton College, from whose records that series was published in the 19th century by Babcock and latterly by Beveridge, Mitchell and Dean. The price was paid for best wheat, which according to Thrupp in her History of the Bakers' Company was 3/4 the weight of the second, which was 3/4 the weight of the third. The lesser quality and therefore heavier wheat perhaps would have contained some chaff, or perhaps even some other grain, as it was sometimes described as red wheat, which in itself is a term used to describe maslin or wheat and rye mixtures. In modern wheat production, the gluten content may be used as a discriminator. There may be discussion on the rights and wrongs of using this series because second wheat, not best, was the basis for the assize in London, as well as the location of the market. However, it should be noted that there was consideration in 1632 that the price of wheat paid at various markets around London should be used as a basis for the assize within the city itself. In this slide, I've plotted the weight in ounces of the penny wheaten loaf obtained from the refectories against the price of Eton wheat. To make the comparison easier to comprehend and to overcome the fact that the weight of loaf fell as the price of wheat rose, I've inverted the changes in the weight of the penny wheaten loaf. And using a similar method to Bolton, I've calculated a price and weight index from 1601 to 1610 and plotted percentage changes year on year. The correlation coefficient shown refers to the original data and confirms the statistically significant relationship at the 1% level between the two variables. It can be seen that there is a very close relationship between the weight of the 1 penny wheaten loaf and the price of a quarter of best wheat paid at the Windsor market. While it is not surprising that this is so, because of the way the weight of bread was computed from the price of wheat, it is reassuring that this relationship holds for the Eton price series, suggesting at the very least that its use is valid and probably reflects prices paid in London. More importantly, and to answer Bolton's point, it confirms that the assize was working throughout the period under question. It also tells us that there does not appear to have been any attempt to regulate the price of wheat paid in the wholesale markets, as the weight of the penny wheaten loaf varied from as little as 8 ounces to as much as 17 ounces. In this regard, market forces were allowed to operate, as can be seen in this slide, which I've shown again. Consequently, there were times when the consumer received only half the amount of bread compared to other times. This appears to be the case in 1608, the early 1620s, 1630, and 1638. Only the last date was not included in Hoskins' years of bad harvest. The consumer was left with choices: to manage with less bread, to pay more for the same amount, or to buy a loaf of inferior quality. The assize was policed by the Bakers' Company, who operated a system of fines, imprisonment within their halls, and also in Newgate, or dismissal from the company. To punish bakers who'd sold underweight bread, white bakers who baked brown bread, or those who baked on Sundays. I shall not have time to discuss this and the other various measures that the city authorities introduced to maintain standards in the weight of loaves, nor their attempts to make wheat go further by insisting at times that loaves included rye or even turnip roots in addition to wheat. These were only occasional instructions, some of which were issued when wheat prices rose. Another interesting finding from the repertory records of the assize publication was that in a considerable number there was reference to petitioning from the Company of White Bakers to keep the assize down. They only petitioned when the weight of bread was about to be raised, although not on every occasion when this occurred. Why did the bakers lobby to keep the assize down? The obvious reason was to maintain their profit, particularly as their allowance remained fixed at 6 shillings per quarter of wheat baked throughout the period, with an unsuccessful attempt to have it raised to 6 shillings 10 pence in 1622 in a direct approach to the Privy Council. The evidence that the bakers petitioning to have the assize lowered by the Court of Aldermen is inconclusive. There are one or two examples when they were clearly unsuccessful, and others when the assize was lowered, but not necessarily in response to their petition. Put simply, the bakers could bake wheat using wheat that was cheaper than that from which the assize was set, or delay any rise in the weight of the 1 penny wheaten loaf. They could maintain or increase their profit margin. Unfortunately, the one piece of evidence that's missing from this proposition is a baker's account book. The petitioning of the bakers and the response of the Court of Aldermen suggests that the consumer's interest, except in the matter of the loaf's content and weight, were not always at the forefront of the deliberations on the assize. I can show my evidence for this later in discussion if required. If we return to Bolton's conclusions, I have shown that the assize operated throughout the period, 1600 to 1640. And if the weight of Bolton's 1 pound loaf is replotted against the Eton-Wee series, we obtain a very close fit, with a high correlation using the raw data, again highly statistically significant. This is further illustrated if we incorporate the data into Bolton's original slide. It can be seen that the assize was working and that there was no discrepancy between the prices of bread and wheat, but there is a discrepancy between the Eton series and Bolton's flour prices. This suggests to me that the flour prices in his series, which were obtained from institutions and large houses, do not reflect the price of wheat on which the assize was based. There is some evidence that bakers lobbied to have the assize of weight lowered to maximise their profits, which would not have benefited the consumer. However, more significant is the action by the city authority to hold the baker's allowance at 6 shillings per quarter of wheat baked, thereby keeping the overall cost of bread down. I shall now move on to the storage and provision of grain. The concept of storing grain and releasing it onto the markets by buying in bulk when grain was abundant and prices low, and releasing it at cost price or lower when harvests were less satisfactory and prices higher, goes back to classical times. And the practice continued in early modern Italian cities and from a later period in China. The impression from the historiography is that granary storage was the intention of both central and civic governments in England during the 16th and 17th centuries, and indeed took place in London until it was said to have faltered in the 1620s and 1630s. See McGrath, Outhwaite and others. I shall not cover the situation outside London except to say that grain storage was very limited, and where it did occur in Exeter, Norwich, Salisbury and to some extent Bristol, it was only directed at a limited number of poor people. Part of the system in London was the release of subsidised meal to the markets for the poor, referred to by Archer. This topic raises a number of issues as to whether the storage of grain in early modern London was in any way parallel to the classical concept of granaries. Time does not permit me to address more than a few of these topics. I've examined a number of livery company court minutes, primarily of the Great 12, and cross-referenced these to the Journal of Court of Common Council, the refectories and central government records. The storage of grain in London, granaries, at Leadenhall, Queenhithe and Bridge House was organised by the City of London from the mid-16th century, initially with private finance and then with contributions from the livery companies. This was in the form of loans, although the word tax does appear in some of the precepts. Following the loss of £2,100 and approximately 200 quarters of grain from a shipment from the Baltic in the 1570s, the livery companies were clearly unhappy that they were losing money. A committee formed by the Court of Aldermen, which included representatives of the Great 12, was tasked with deciding what changes should be made to the prevailing arrangements. In summary, the companies agreed to both finance and purchase grain and also to take responsibility for its storage and subsequent distribution as meal to the markets. The Lord Mayor, through the Court of Common Council, would retain overall direction. This system lasted approximately 100 years, although the data on its full implementation becomes sparse after 1640. This arrangement required the livery companies, principally the Great 12, to place in storage 5,000, subsequently increased to 10,000 quarters of wheat per year. Although wheat was the main commodity, there were times when the companies were expected to take rye from the eastern merchants trading from the Baltic. The grain was to be stored in 12 granaries provided at Bridge House and Bridewell by the city. This slide shows the proportions allocated to each company, which remained essentially the same for the next 50 years, with minor changes, for instance when the apothecaries became separated from the grocers' company and when the brown bakers were incorporated into the white bakers and then separated again. The allocation of grain for each company was based on the same proportions expected of them to provide men-at-arms and other loans by the companies, for example to the Irish and Virginia plantations and loans to the Crown. Some companies had their own stores, the leather sellers, brown bakers and barber surgeons, but the impression from the literature that all the companies had storage within their halls is incorrect. But it is difficult to establish what the lesser companies with very small allocations did with their grain. The companies were expected to hold their proportion in readiness to furnish the markets with meal, as ordered by the Lord Mayor. For example, in a precept from 1617, which lists the larger companies, when they were expected to deliver meal on a weekly basis, and until a further order was issued. And again in 1630, which includes some of the lesser companies. The precepts contained instructions on price and quantities to be sold, with the order that no individual was to buy more than a small amount, with the intention of preventing dealers or their agents buying up the subsidised meal. The reference to bakers and chandlers indicates that the intention was for the companies to bring their own additional wheat into London, either from counties around London or overseas, and not to make use of wheat that was already there. At the time the precept was sent to the merchant tailors, their court minutes record that they had no corn in store, and the Court of Assistants ordered the master and warden to purchase some. This leads on to the company's response to the precept on the storage of corn, of wheat. I shall return to the supply of meal to the markets later. It was the companies who set up this scheme with a system of audits, certificates and other inspections of stores and granaries by their own members and by aldermen nominated by the court. On occasion, the master and wardens were required to bring evidence of the amount of storage by attending the Guildhall at the Lord Mayor's pleasure. All this was to check that they had the allocation of the annual amount of 10,000 quarters required by the city, usually by the 1st of April. Despite the companies setting up the system, it was clear that they rarely fulfilled their obligation to hold their full allocation of grain in store. This slide shows the response which the companies' court assistants of the merchant tailors and grocers made to the precept to the purchase of grain. It is typical of the Great 12 companies. You will see that it was rare for them to fulfill their obligations. There may have been a very good rationale for this. There was good reason not to store too much corn, as there was the risk of it deteriorating if left too long, with frequent mention of musty grain, damp and weevils. The companies were allowed to trade in corn, but if it remained unsold or was surplus to the requirements to furnish the markets, they could suffer financial and material loss. Although I do not have time to discuss further aspects of granary management, there are examples when this was less than adequate. This slide shows the same data for the fishmongers and ironmongers, with the former perhaps more likely to comply. They may have felt obliged to do so as they had some responsibility for the provision of fish stocks, although, as will be mentioned later, the fishmongers' company did not fulfil their obligation in 1632. The data has been obtained primarily from the Great 12, and therefore it's difficult to draw a conclusion about the lesser companies. But of those records reviewed, the carpenters, brown bakers and tallow chandlers shown here may have been more likely to fulfil their obligations, perhaps because they were asked to provide less. It's likely that the bakers would have stored grain for their own use. These tables, taken together with the frequency of precepts, either in the city or company records, illustrate two important points. First, that the precepts on storage of grain were being sent to the companies right up to 1640, and therefore that the system did not fall into abeyance as suggested by Grass and Herbert in the 1620s or mid-1630s. Secondly, that the companies rarely complied with the precept, but at the same time recorded this fact in their records. The very same people who were the masters and wardens of the livery companies were part of the city elite and its governing classes, who were overseeing the system. So presumably everyone knew what was going on, suggesting a degree of complicity. Were any sanctions taken against the livery companies for their failure to comply? There are limited examples. It's worth describing events in the early 1630s to illustrate some of these points. There was obvious concern about grain supplies at this time when the price of wheat had risen. The Crown and Privy Council required the Lord Mayor to let them know what steps were being taken to ensure that the companies were fulfilling their obligations. The Privy Council also required Lord Mayor Jury to conduct an audit of how much grain was required by the City of London. This consisted of two parts. In the first, he had estimated that he had 130,280 people under his jurisdiction living in the 26 wards, including Bridge Without. Jury's figures can be found in the 1665 publication by Graunt on the Bills of Mortality. In the second part, he estimated that each individual could manage on 8 ounces of bread a day. Incidentally, this would have provided only 730 calories. He estimated the city could manage on 5,000 quarters of grain a month, or 60,000 quarters a year. The 60,000 figure does not appear in any other official document, but the Privy Council did expect the city, through the livery companies, to store 30,000 quarters in both 1631 and 1632. It was against this background that the Privy Council demanded that the Lord Mayor act. The Lord Mayor wrote to the Privy Council in December 1632 complaining that companies had been negligent in the storage of corn and that he had, quote, committed to Newgate divers of the wardens of the companies and intended to proceed to the punishment of others who had made default, unquote. A list of the names of those imprisoned in Newgate was provided, but no longer exists. Some names were included in the minutes of the Court of Aldermen of the 4th of December 1632, quote, Mr. Langham, Richard Bull, John Sallard and Roger Hughes, wardens of the Fishmongers' Company, James Woodfall, the warden of the Skinners' Company, and Messrs. Sly and Lambourne of the White Bakers' Company, unquote. They were confined, quote, for not providing their provision of corn, respectively, to make up the annual provision of 10,000 quarters of corn for the last year. The accounts of the Merchant Taylors' Company includes reference to the payment of £23 for fees and other charges at Newgate to get Warden Bardolph out of prison. There is a further example from the leather sellers' records. In 1634, when they complained in mitigation that they'd been let down by their supplier, Mr. Sly, an appropriate name one might think, but as we've heard, he was a warden of the White Bakers' Company and also the master on more than one occasion. And the Drapers' Company was singled out in 1633 for failure to provide their proportion of corn, with correspondence continuing until 1638. The mayor wrote on 4 separate occasions, but with no mention of penalties. But generally the company seemed to have escaped censure or punishment for their failure to have the requisite amount of grain in store. However, this does not necessarily mean that they did not have sufficient grain available to fulfill their obligation to the markets for most of the time. If we now return to the episode in 1631 when the companies bypassed the markets and sent meal direct to the wards, the only year in which this happened. In the 1631 episode, the companies were expected to provide meal directly to the ward aldermen for distribution to the parishes and thence to named individuals, following the audit mentioned earlier, which identified households in need and numbers living there. Clearly, the exceptional circumstances required that the meal be made available at subsidised prices to these individuals. They were still paying for the meal, although the church warden accounts demonstrate that any additional cost in distribution, carriage, etc. was borne by the parish. The church warden accounts of the parish of All Hallows the Great indicate that the poor were paying the parish for meal at 6 shillings per bushel, but also that the parish had some meal to be sold at 3 shillings per bushel. A similar arrangement pertained at St. Bartholomew by the Exchange. Allied to the scheme was the requirement upon the companies who failed to deliver their allocation of meal to pay the ward a fine of 3 shillings per bushel, in lieu, quote, for every bushel of corn wanting, unquote. Whether the companies had to find the corn in addition to paying the fine is not entirely clear. The leather sellers appeared in the Court of Aldermen in May 31 when they were given the option of providing 3/4 of corn, or if they did not do so, to accept a fine as seen in this slide. Hardly a stiff sentence. Whether the companies decided to accept the fine rather than find the wheat is not clear, as I've said. But the fact that some of meal was available in All Hallows the Great at 3 shillings a bushel suggests that there may have been a connection between this and the fines paid by the company. The data I found confirms that in addition to the company's storage of corn, the requirement that the companies furnish the markets continued throughout the 1630s, as shown here. The granary system in London, organised by the livery companies and overseen by the city authorities, was not designed to provide grain for anything more than a fraction of the population, and as such was not comparable to the classical granary system, which generally served the whole population. However, the fact that meal was sold in the markets below the prevailing price does fit with the classical concept. Whether the provision of grain, and more importantly delivery of subsidised meal to the poor via the markets, had any effect on well-being is uncertain, as the data on morbidity and mortality is insufficiently robust. But I do have evidence, which I've not shown, that there was no excess mortality in the years of high prices within the parishes I've examined. The absence of food riots, apart from one single episode involving sailors in the late 1620s, could also be taken as a measure of success. I shall now turn to the provision of fuel and make only short reference to this topic to make a couple of important points. Coal was becoming the principal domestic and industrial fuel in London at the start of the 17th century, and the city organised the importation primarily from the northeast, from the hostman of Newcastle, of 4,000 chaldrons, which we would now call cauldrons, equivalent to 5,520 tonnes of coal, every year specifically for distribution to the poor. This table shows the considerable increase in coal imports to London, and an estimate based on the population figures from Professor Harding's paper of per capita consumption is in accord with the estimates provided by other authors such as Hatcher, and more recently Will Cabot, who very kindly made data from his thesis available to me. You will see that 4,000 cauldrons represents a very small proportion of imports using Neff's estimates, from just under 4% in 1605 to 6, falling to just under 2% in 1637-8. City authorities, together with the coal merchants, organised the purchase and storage of coal, primarily at Bridewell. The merchants underwriting most of the finance, except when the city made use of a legacy left by the late Sir Thomas Campbell, erstwhile Lord Mayor, and whose family were involved in the coal trade. £300 was taken from the legacy on a number of occasions. Therefore, in contrast to the provision of grain which had been devolved to the livery companies, the city retained control of coal distribution to the poor. The coal was available for purchase by the parishes to distribute to their poor and pensioners using their own money or an administration of legacies. The city's contribution continued into the 1630s. Importantly, the 4,000 cauldrons of coal was exempt from customs duty, usually levied at 12 pence a cauldron, under a statute from James I in 1605. This was revisited several times over the next 30 years, particularly when there was a significant price rise, with the city lobbying the Crown for continuation of this arrangement. The Crown also at times relaxed prohibition on exports to allow traders to re-export coal if unsold. It was argued, in the same way that this facility was extended to grain traders, that this would encourage imports and trade into London. Despite these subsidies, the price of coal available to parishes fluctuated with market forces. This data has been obtained from the churchwarden accounts of St Michael, Bassishaw, in which there was a separate fuel account between 1617, when the available records commenced, and 1633, after which the account was absorbed into the churchwarden's main accounts. This data has been compared to that from Westminster College, published in Hatcher's book on coal, in which he used Lord Beveridge's original data. It is perhaps surprising that the abrupt rise in prices post-1625 is not seen in the Westminster account, as this was a real phenomenon reported in the city records, and was coincident with war with France and Spain, which together with piracy by Dunkirkers disrupted coal shipments down the east coast. There is evidence from the Remembrantia and State Papers that the city called upon support from the Crown to protect shipping, with an additional levy placed on coal shipping. A figure of 2 shillings per cauldron was suggested to prepare 40 sailing ships from Newcastle in a warlike manner. When the price rose significantly in 1627, in November of that year, the city was able to make coal available to the poor at a price equivalent to 6 pence per bushel, which equals 18 shillings per cauldron, to be sold in volumes of 1/2 bushel and a peck to those poor in possession of a certificate. At that time, the cost of St Michael, Bassishaw was over 30 shillings per cauldron. Unfortunately, there was disorder at Bridewell when the coal was distributed. A decision was made to divide the coal between the city wards and send it to the wards for distribution directly to the parish poor and pensioners, a process overseen by the officials of Vintry Ward. This initially involved 25 cauldrons, and a further 100 cordons were released at the slightly higher price of 7p per bushel, 21 shillings a cordon, in December 1627, but the price came down to 6p and then 5.5p per bushel in January and March 1628. This episode perhaps resonates with the distribution of meal in the wards in 1631. If I return briefly to annual consumption figures, the warden's accounts of St Mary Magdalene Milk Street record that 26 sacks were given annually to 8 named pensioners, and although not divided evenly, amounted on average to half a ton per year per person. In the parish of St Bartholomew by the Exchange, 3/4 of a ton per year on average was given to 13 pensioners. Archer quotes a figure of 1 ton per annum for those in almshouses in the 1590s. These amounts are in accord with a per capita consumption shown in the city as a whole, which would have included industrial consumption. It can be concluded that the provision of fuel to the nominated poor was subsidised by the city and would have provided at least some of the fuel requirements of pensioners and others under the control of wards and parishes. The system required assistance from central government in foregoing import duty, and control was retained by the city authorities and coal traders rather than devolved to the delivery companies. The 4,000 cauldron provision was a small fraction of overall city consumption. I've demonstrated that the city authorities during the period 1600-1640 played an active role in ensuring that some of the poor received support in the form of wheat meal and coal. Although the city continued to set the assize of bread throughout the period, there was no specific intention to help the poor, except in regard of the baker's allowance, which was held at 6 shillings per quarter of bread baked, despite the attempts by the Bakers' Company to have that raised. This had the effect of keeping the weight of the 1p wheaten loaf up, even by a few penny weights. I've demonstrated that there was a strong correlation between the weight of the 1p wheaten loaf and the price of best wheat paid in the Windsor market, Eton Wheat Series. This shows that the assize was responsive to wheat prices, which do not appear to have been regulated in any way, except by the attempts of the city and central government to ensure minimum supplies, often from overseas, and primarily the Baltic. The purchase, provision and distribution of grain in the form of meal by the livery companies also continued throughout the period of study. The initial impetus of the companies to take this over was the concern in the 1570s that they were losing money, and in respect of storage, they rarely fulfilled the obligation which they had accepted then. The annual provision of 10,000 quarters was only a small proportion of the city's overall consumption, which raises questions about its purpose. At one level, it appears to have provided a basic level of relief to those known to the city through the parishes, but we cannot be certain whether it reached those poor outside the system. It could be argued, but I cannot provide any evidence, that the authorities had to be seen to be doing something, and certainly the absence of riots and lack of effect on mortality during dearth years suggests that the city was successful in both providing a basic level of insurance and in being seen to be doing something to support the poor. The same can be said for the provision of coal, although I consider the more interesting aspect that the city with the coal merchants retained control of the purchase and distribution rather than devolving it to the delivery companies. Presumably the merchants were able to underwrite the cost for much of the time without undue risk. My work on the role of wards and parishes, their interaction with the city authorities and response to crisis will have to be the subject of a separate presentation. Thank you.